Okay. Now I'm going to talk about what we do at EPA when you guys submit standards. So, standards development and review. There's a disclaimer that basically says, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But most of the stuff on here comes strictly from the regs, so I think you can pay attention to this. So, what we will discuss is we're going to discuss the process by which states, and by states I mean states, territories, and tribes, review their water quality standards and the revision process. And so there's three key elements. Kelly, Celine. And one of them is the triennial review, which we'll talk about, the public participation requirements, which we'll talk about, and the minimum requirements for water quality standards packages. And then finally, we'll talk about EPA's review of state authorized tribes standards and actions that if the state or tribe, if their standards do not meet the Clean Water Act requirements. So, how often are triennial reviews supposed to be done? Anybody? Every 3 years. Excellent. And I stress this because, at EPA we now have one of our requirements is to make sure that they're done every 3 years, and we have to report to headquarters if there's any laggard states, tribes, or territories. And you have to hold a public hearing with at least 45-day public notice. You need to re-examine and revise any segments with less than 101A use, and everybody knows what a 101A use is now. You need to provide an explanation if you're not adopting criteria. I don't like reading, let me just talk. So this bullet right here is all about EPA works hard to develop these 304A criteria to get the science, and states ignore them. So now what we require in the triennial review is a requirement that states at least look at our 304A numbers and provide an explanation why they're not adopting them. So that was a new requirement that came within the 2015 regs. And then, you have to submit your work, you have to show your results to EPA.
Hey, Terry, can I jump in for just a moment?
You may.
And for the regional water boards in California, one thing to consider is whether or not at state level there are any plans in the works to do a state standards action that might adopt some of those 304A numbers. So that's one just consideration to include. So get in touch with us if you're starting to do a triennial review and look at those 304A numbers.
Yeah, and let me add on to that. Thank you, Rebecca. So because California has promulgated federal regulations, if you guys adopt one of our 304A criteria that's in the CTR, we're going to depromulgate that number in the CTR for your area where you have that number. So it requires some work on our part, but we're happy to do it. We pretty much wait till they have like 3 or 4, and then we do them. Stacy?
That depromulgation, obviously, it comes subsequent to EPA approval
Right.
of the standard adopted. So is the approval of the standard that's being adopted where you may exert some discretion or opinion as to the level of protectiveness, as compared to the CTR that we're replacing, if perhaps it's less stringent?
Oh, that's interesting. So, typically when we review standards, we're evaluating the stringency between what EPA recommends and what you guys are proposing. And so you can be more stringent than what EPA recommends, but you can't be less stringent. I will say that the CTR values are pretty old, and a lot of them have been revised. So I think the expectation is that when you adopt a new 304A criteria in California, it will be more stringent, or actually based on better science than they were in whenever we did the CTR in 2000.
But you said that it couldn't be less stringent? That the subsequent one adopted by the state may not be less stringent unless it's on newer science?
Right. If it's protective of the use, that's the real threshold. So if you can establish that's protective of the use, it doesn't matter what the number is. Aoife, I forgot, I'm sorry.
And then it's a first question. It's a triennial review process.
Yeah.
It's a rulemaking process, or it's a process involving SMEs for review, users or other ones. If it's a rulemaking process, when it started, when we consider that it's rulemaking, because in which step the lawyers should be involved. Another question, second question, when we can, if after the rule valid, okay, let me rephrase, when we can say that it's the next TR process launched, after public holiday or after the rule validation?
Okay, Stacy wants to respond to the first one, so go ahead.
Certainly, as to your question as to whether triennial review is a rulemaking process, it is not. And so it does not go to OAL. So we're not establishing a plan or a rule. What we're establishing is a strategy for moving forward with respect to the priorities that we've identified. But it sort of appears to be a rulemaking insofar as we do need to adhere to the federal public participation requirements that Terry's discussing. And so sometimes it can look like a similar process, but it's not. And it also doesn't implicate CEQA. So we also do not need to, strictly speaking, do not need to comply with our regulations to comply with CEQA. But we hold a hearing. We often allow for comments, and we respond to comments. And these parallel processes that correspond to EPA's regulations, not our state regulations.
Why I'm asking, in Arizona, for example, when we conduct triennial review process, we involved our lawyers, and mean that it's the lawyers in our department, not the compliance team or other team. Then they supported us with formulation, with the talking with the governments, with GERC, with the Secretary of State or someone like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that. But it's we're gonna to in July we expect some Kaizen event. That is where we discuss that process. We're gonna to conduct TR process split between TR and TR rulemaking, because we all SMEs and scientists involved in the process provide review monitoring data, assessed all users, and it's all water bodies, appeal appendixes, everything. And then once it's where we consider that section of the rule or standards should be changed or updated. And then we informed about it, and then involve our lawyers for further stage. It's after when public review started, it started the rulemaking process.
Yeah, so let me just say that different states do triennial
Yeah.
reviews differently. So in California, there's a process for triennial review, which is a plan, and then they have a rulemaking process for the standard. In some other states like Arizona and Hawaii, the triennial review and the water quality standards development are pretty much the same process. So that's why this is a difference in the answers. Okay, where am I now? I forgot where I was. Celine, you're going to tell me where I was?
No. Just as a follow-up to Stacy's question regarding adopting standards that are less stringent than the CTR. We did that with lead in Region 4 when we used the recalculation procedure. And basically, the only difference between the new criteria and the old one is that we used an updated EPA data set. So it had much more up-to-date toxicity data, and that led to a number that was substantially higher than the previous number, and EPA depromulgated the number.
Yeah, we approved first, and then we promulgated, depromulgated.
I have a question about the peer review. The way that I understand it, California has a separate requirement for expert peer review prior to distribution for public peer review or for public review. Do we have a separate rule that requires us to perform an independent expert peer review before it goes out for public comment?
So we're talking about triennial review right now. So why don't we, yeah, public comment for the triennial review. All right, and you can hold that question until we talk to the other one, because I think that's a good question.
Like when we can see that the next round year process, when can we start? When we can see that the next year round started?
There's no requirement on when you start it. There is a requirement that it's done every 3 years. And I know it's complicated in Arizona because you send us big package, we approve and not act on other parts. And so the timing is weird. Talk to Matt Bolt and figure that out. I don't have an answer. Okay. Okay. I found out where I was. This is the water quality standards review process. Basically developing criteria is a 1 to 3. In the case of toxicity, a 1 to 20 year process. I know I was snarky. I apologize. But EPA has this vision that things are going to happen every 3 years. Stakeholder action committees, public hearings, adoption, submit to EPA. And then EPA has 2 months to 2 years to approve. And let me explain what that means. Really, we have 60 days to approve a package, right? So you give it to us on one day, 60 days later, we have to make a decision. If we disapprove, if we plan to disapprove, we have 90 days to do that. One of the biggest challenges for us is that you guys give us packages, and there's these ESA issues that we have to deal with, and sometimes that could take a long time. So we want to encourage folks who are developing these standards to talk to their services and engage them early. It's not a requirement that you do it, it's our requirement, but it helps us out if you guys do it too. And then finally, if we disapprove, we have a requirement to promulgate promptly. I think the latest guidance, just not in written guidance, but guidance from above, is that, we want to promulgate within 270 days, which is pretty rapid. So obviously, we do not want to disapprove things. We want to work with you guys early to make sure the ESA is happening and to make sure that the standard is approvable. Okay? Yeah.
So there's no deemed approval if you don't approve within 60 days?
I'm sorry?
So if you don't approve within 60 days, is it just deemed approved, or you just...
No, we have another 30 days to disapprove.
Okay.
Yeah. And remember when we were talking about standards before, there was a section that says if water quality standards are not, I'm missing the words, are not enforceable until they've been approved by EPA.
Okay. So the 60 days isn't hard and fast in any way. The 60 days to approve. Because if you could disapprove after that, I just find that a little...
This is the reg language. 60 days to approve, 90 days to disapprove. So we're working really hard now to meet our 60-day approval window. Sometimes it goes over because we have this long ESA process. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to remind to use the mic. That was it.
Church, with respect to the deemed approval, you might be thinking about the Office of Administrative Law and their deadline to approve within 30 days, or it's deemed approved.
I was
Perhaps.
just wondering if there was
Yeah.
an equivalent. But does that,
Oh, did you have another question?
does this also apply to TMDLs, the timing?
No, TMDLs have a different timeline.
Just quick question. So the ESA requirements, do you mind just touching on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So if there are criteria that have the potential to affect aquatic life, endangered species in particular, then we have to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS and get their concurrence before we can approve. So that's sort of the headache that we have sometimes. We have a policy that if it's a human health criteria, that we don't have to do ESA on that. So it's just aquatic life, not rec, just aquatic life. Okay. More questions? Okay. So I think a lot of you already know this, but you know, engage your stakeholders, EPA and the public early. The stakeholders is obvious. EPA is simply because we need to know what's going on so we can meet our 60-day window. Review the designated uses and the criteria, anti-DAG, and general provisions. So you learned yesterday that some general provisions are water quality standards. Actually, this will be fun. Does anyone remember what those were? Just shout them out. Did I hear mixing zones? Compliance schedules? And there was one other, begins with a V. Thank you. I mentioned this before, but in the past, a lot of guys were doing 30-day public reviews. And so, again, it's a 45 public review time with the material at least 30 days. This comes out of 40 CFR 25.5. Again, it says identify and discuss with EPA. Draft your rulemaking, hold at least one public hearing. This is just a basic process, you know. Get comments, consider your comments, finalize, adopt provisions, get Attorney General certification, or in the case of California, Office of Administrative Law, and submit the results and supporting analysis to not me, but our regional administrator. And then it sort of comes down to me. Public participation is a real thing. It's not a, I'm just gonna check the box and do a not so good job. And this also, you know, involves, I'm not just gonna inform the people I think are gonna be interested, but it's about informing the general public. So let me read this because I don't have anything else to say. Public participation is that part of the decision-making process through which responsible officials become aware of public attitudes by providing ample opportunity for interested and affected parties to communicate their views. It includes seeking input and dialogue with the public, assimilating public views and preferences, providing access to decision-making processes, and demonstrating that the public reviews have been considered. And again, you notice the 40 CFR 25.5. Actually, it's 24.3. This is just, you know, it's early and meaningful involvement. So identify the key stakeholders in the community. encourage and enable community members to get involved. So, if you have meetings in the day, sometimes it's hard for the general public to go to. If you have meetings that are sort of far away, it's hard for, NGOs that want to comment to go to these things. So think about it when you're doing your public meetings. Listen carefully to what folks are saying. Take the time needed to deal with community concerns. And make changes if they're warranted by community comment and have merit. Keep the community well informed. I know that California uses the LIRIS list to do that. It's a pretty good way to do it. And then promote transparency and explain to the community what has been done and why. And there's a couple of example resources on how to do meaningful public participation. Yeah, go ahead.
With regard to the responsiveness summary in the federal participation regs, can you elaborate on what EPA construes that to look like with a little more detail that's in the reg than what's in the reg?
So what the response to comments should look like? Is that the question?
That's correct. I mean, it's called a responsiveness summary, and it
Yeah.
says something like in salient points during the process that there be responses. And so it doesn't seem to contemplate the linear response to comment that we do. And I just was wondering if it looked like something different, if something different than what we do is also acceptable, what that might look like.
So I think there's lots of ways to respond to comments. Some people print the letter and identify everything and respond. Some people summarize, the salient comments that are common across. I don't think there's any guidance that we have on how to respond to comments. It's just a requirement. Gemma, do you have another answer to that? Me? I'm sorry, Melissa. No, I think you. All right, excellent. So again, 40 CFR 13120 requires a public hearing in accordance with 40 CFR 25.5. And before the hearing, at least 30 days before the hearing, the agency makes available the proposed standards and any supporting information to interpret the standard. And this is bulleted here that the same minimum requirements apply to adopting new standards and to revisions. So in the case of Celine, where they did a recalculation, right? That was a revision to an existing standard. We treated it as a new water quality standard. Minimum requirements under 40 CFR 25.5 is that there's a public notice at least 45 days before the hearing. There's this sort of parenthetical that says it could be 30 days if it's really not that controversial or that complex. But my message to you is make it 45. Identify the topics that are relevant. Have this time and location that facilitates attendance by the public. Accessible by public transportation is usually a good thing. Provide testimony, both scheduled and unscheduled. I assume that means like the written stuff before and the oral comment afterward. Conduct a hearing, provide information regarding the issues and decisions and information needed from the public. Consider questions and answers. And then this procedures shall not unduly inhibit free expression of views. I'm not sure exactly where that comes from, probably 25.5. And then have a transcript or recording of the proceedings and provide them at no more than cost. Other tools for public participation, informational repositories, mailing lists, public notification, public meetings, response to comments. This is all pretty similar to all you guys because you're involved in developing standards. Communication strategy. So, I mean, it's not just enough to send out something, you know, make sure that you have a way to sort of target the people that, in addition to the general public, but the people that you think will be affected. Outreach strategy should outline the objectives and goals of what's needed to be communicated, identify stakeholders, which are the interested, affected, or concerned parties, define your key messages, establish a timeline, and determine methods for communicating. And again, there's some resources for how to do communication strategy. Okay, so that's all on your end. No, there's one more on your end. So when you submit water quality standards to review by EPA, you need to make sure that it includes one of the three following, right? One or more. So uses consistent with the Act, uses for 101A2 and or a UAA if you're doing that, criteria that's sufficient to protect those uses, anti-degradation procedures that are consistent with your anti-degradation policy, and if applicable, general policies, which include mixing zones, variances, compliance schedules, and authorizing provisions. Oh, I'm sorry, compliance schedule authorizing provisions. Yeah, my fault. Okay. So what are the minimum requirements for submitting a water quality standards package to EPA? You need to provide the methods and used and the analyses conducted to support the revisions, or in this case, provisions. A certificate from the Attorney General or the tribal legal authority or other appropriate legal authority within the state or tribe that the standards were duly adopted pursuant to state or tribal law, which in this case is, in California, the Office of Administrative Law. General information to aid the EPA in determining the adequacy and the scientific basis of the standards that do not include the uses specified in 101A2U, 101A2, as well as any information on general policies applicable to state and tribal water quality standards that may affect their application and implementation. I have 30 minutes. I'm like almost done. You guys should ask more questions.
Terry, I have a question.
All right, excellent.
Your comment yesterday and today about the Office of Administrative Law typically is the entity that certifies that the standard was adopted pursuant to state law. When we submit a standards action to Office of Administrative Law, we provide an Office of Chief Counsel certification that that the standard was adopted in accordance with Porter Cologne, the federal participation regs, and that certification is actually required by the government code within the Administrative Procedures Act and is required to be included within the packet that we send to OAL. And so my question is, are you certain that it's not that OCC certification that is in fact the other appropriate legal authority certifying that it was duly adopted in accordance with state law?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've been working on this since 2008, and we've always considered OAL. If we need to reopen this, that would be interesting and useful. And the reason this would be useful is that a lot of times we're waiting for OAL before we can begin our work. So that'd be a good thing to look at, because I'm not sure. think I went through the slide, right? So this is a schematic, oh, here I am, of our action. We get a package. We have 60 days to make a decision about whether we're going to approve or disapprove. If we approve, life is good for us and for you, assuming that we got our ESA issues resolved. If we disapprove, we're basically required to promulgate promptly. And again, our sort of guidance is we want to do that within 270 days, which puts a burden on us. I think I've already said this, but EPA has 60 days to approve the water quality standards. That's in reg. And 90 days to disapprove the water quality standards. Also in reg. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Ava.
If state criteria is more stringent than EPA recommended, for example, if we take aluminum, sorry if I'm wrong pronunciation, aluminium? Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. Then it's, what's required, negotiation with the EPA? Will we need to provide, of course we need to provide evidence, and it's, do we have any recommended ways or recommended steps for...
So you're talking about a situation where the state is approving a standard that's more stringent than ours?
Yeah, for example, state standard is more stringent than
Yeah.
EPA recommended. And that in order to, what the actions should state do in order to get approval of the state state criteria?
So it's really just providing the information used to generate that number. Maybe it's background or whatever. Provide that information, and we will pretty much always approve a number that's lower.
It's no need any additional paperwork or
No, just
meetings or something?
Providing
Okay.
the scientific justification for that number,
Okay.
or the rationale for that number. Okay, so when EPA looks at a water quality standards, sometimes we get these very, very long packages, and the issue for us is what in this long package is a water quality standard, and what might be implementation or something else, or just explanation. And so this 4-part test was developed about, 10 years ago, I'm guessing, and we have a frequently asked questions module in the handout that talks about this. And really, it's just, is it legally binding? Okay, that's one part. Does it address the uses, criteria, or anti-degradation? So the 3 things that we consider water quality standards. Check. Does it establish the desired condition of in-stream protection, right? So that's another requirement. Check. And then finally, is it new or revised? Check. If it meets all of those 4 tests, those 4 parts, we will consider it a water quality standard. If it meets 3 of them, we will not. Okay? So that's important to know. Yeah, Cindy.
Would you mind elaborating on number 3? Does it establish the desired condition or in-stream level of protection? Like just a range of examples that you've come across?
Yeah. So the number for the stream for copper is 5, right? Or biocriteria shall be, bugs that have a California Stream Condition Index number of 0.79 or something like that. You're basically saying to everyone, these are the values that apply to the stream. Yeah. This is a question here first.
Just in follow-up to that, then if there's a standard that says they have to sample so often to come up with a certain number to evaluate whether they're meeting criteria. That wouldn't be a water quality
That
standard.
is not a water quality standard.
And just if they're looking at the point source discharge and saying the discharge has to be a certain quality, that's not a water quality standard either.
Yeah, so I'm answering these things sort of off the cuff based on your description, but to me, that sounds like it's not a water quality standard. Yeah, so things like you have to sample so many times to get a number are not really water quality. They're sort of like how you want to implement the standard. Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot.
So, number 3, desired condition and in-stream level of protection has to be a number. It can't be like good or awful or awesome. You know, it actually has to be 0.65 or 1.32.
You know, I don't know if that's true or not. Do you want to elaborate, Melissa? She's looking at me like, what? No, I don't want to elaborate.
I mean, without knowing more about the specific language, it would be hard to say, but I mean, if you have narrative criteria, then it's still be water quality standard.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as what we're looking to act on meets all 4 of those questions would be considered a standard. So does it establish a desired condition of in-stream level protection, a narrative criteria is still established in-stream level.
A follow-up question?
Hold on, let me just, so are you finished?
It's a matter of somehow measuring the accuracy of your determination of that desired condition. So how well can you actually determine that it's good or bad?
It's more of whether it's a water quality standard or whether it's, some sort of assessment language, or whether it's a implementation language,
Yeah.
permitting language, and that's more of, we're trying to determine if it's a water quality standard or if it's something that's not a water quality.
Yeah, so if it was like a permit effluent limit, that wouldn't be a water quality standard. But that is, identifying the desired condition.
Our determination of if something is a water quality standard or not is separate from whether it is approvable or disapprovable.
Melissa, you want to try to use the mic too? Thanks.
I just wanted to add the point that this 4-part test is to determine whether something is a water quality standard, a new or revised water quality standard that EPA could act on under Clean Water Act 303(c)(3). It's independent of whether the submission is approvable or disapprovable. So first we have to determine whether it's something we can act on, and then the decision about, whether the standard is something that's approvable is a separate decision. So I think when you were talking about, is the criteria sufficient to protect the use, or is it, I think you were saying a good or bad, that's separate from a decision of whether what is submitted is a water quality standard.
Okay, and Stacy, you wanted something?
A follow-up question to that. So is that to say that submission of a new beneficial use definition and perhaps its designation, strictly construed, is not considered a standard, subject to review and approval because the third element's not present there? I just assumed such is.
Well, I would only assume that if you're establishing a use that is in some way, that is establishing a condition that we want to have in the water body. We want to have it be fishable, swimmable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this should not, if you're changing a use, we're going to ask for you to approve it. These 4 parts, the language of them notwithstanding. And again, if you look at this FAQ, it's more than just these 4 little sentences. There's some language in there. And so I would recommend folks take a look at that.
And can I just add one thing? I think it's also, EPA uses this 4-part test when we receive a submission from the state. This isn't something that the state needs to worry about when you're submitting something to EPA. So this is really just sort of for your information. It's not, this is part of EPA's process when we receive a package.
Yep.
Terry, I have Over here, Jesse.
Jesse.
I just have a quick question. I think I know the answer, but I just want to confirm. If it's a region-specific, like a site-specific objective or a region-wide objective in California, this has to go through the same process, correct? Not just statewide objectives.
Right, and again, I think what Melissa said is correct. This you guys don't have to do that. This is what we do when we're trying to suss out whether, is this implementation? I don't know. Let's ask the questions. Okay? Well, that took some time. Dan?
I'm about to go off the deep rails, so
There you are.
You know, if you wanted to wait, let me know. I'm kind of curious. You were talking about the amount of data that was used to establish meeting the condition versus establish a water quality objective. That
In a previous slide?
no, it's one of your answers. Your answer to someone's first question here. How can I formulate this? I'm a little bit wondering how this water quality standards use of setting what the standard should be relates to maybe some other laws that set baseline numbers, particularly for cleanup in our water quality, in our streams. And I'm thinking about our Leviathan mine, where we're trying to establish something for folks to clean up to, and we're wondering how to set that baseline, and if we follow sort of a standard setting process based on our data set when the water quality has been at a low level since pre-75.
So I'm not going to answer that directly.
Yeah.
I will say that there are different numbers that are used by, Superfund and those places where they do cleanup levels. And they have these things called ARARs, which are applicable, I forget what the ARAR stands for, I'm sorry.
Relevant and reasonable and all sorts of things, yeah.
I'd just say in California, we look at that state board 9249, right? And it's cleanup to background is generally the standard unless they can show that that's not reasonable for some reason. So I would recommend.
Background, not baseline.
Yeah, it's background.
9249?
Yeah.
And then how do you establish what background is for that, though?
That I'm
That's
not
another class, right?
prepared to answer.
Could you use we have reference creeks.
I think you could probably do whatever's reasonable.
So long as Terry's colleagues are all right with it.
So,
That's a state law thing we're talking about in California.
Okay, yeah.
Not the federal. You're right. Under CERCLA, a CERCLA cleanup, the state requirements get incorporated through ARARs.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. And so that's not covered in this course. We can talk over lunch if you want. Where was I? Oh, and then also, does it meet the requirements that are established in the implementing regulations at 40 CFR 131? 15 minutes, I'm doing better now. ESA and NEPA, so these are both requirements. We talked a little bit about ESA, Endangered Species Act, and said that federal agency, that's us, shall consult with Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS, National Marine Fisheries Service, to ensure that the actions are not likely to jeopardize listed species or adversely modify designated critical habitat. And since approving a water quality standard is a federal action, we're subject to those laws, which, thus EPA consults with Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS on standards that may affect listed species or critical habitat, and again, aquatic life use and wildlife uses. NEPA requirements. So there's this section in the Clean Water Act, 511C.1, that excludes most EPA actions under Clean Water Act from NEPA, including standards, approvals, and disapprovals. Yay. Yeah, you guys still do your CEQA. We don't. Is there a question, Lance? No questions on that?
I have a question, Terry. I'm just thinking about the timelines associated with you guys doing a consultation under the Endangered Species Act with Fish or Wildlife or NOAA Fisheries. Is it recommended that we help you earlier than once we submit documents to you for your consideration? I can't imagine you guys are able to successfully do a consultation in a 60, 90-day window of time.
You know, it all depends on the pollutant and perhaps the fish and wildlife person that we are interacting with. We've done stuff within 60 days. We've done stuff that is taking years to sort out. And I think it's a delicate dance. So we have to have enough certainty so we can talk to the services about what the state board is doing. And we don't want to do a whole bunch of work and then find out that the state board or the tribes or the actions have changed. And so I know Deborah is trying to figure out when to start initiation of ESA on the toxicity standards. And so she's trying to plan that out. So it's a good question. We do need your help. So not a requirement, but it helps us.
So in other words, keep in communication with our EPA liaisons throughout the process.
Yeah. I think I changed the page already. Pascal.
For the same note of helping the state to sort of understand what to expect, and indeed those of us who write permits, what sort of conditions have NIMS or Fish and Wildlife Services typically put on their consultations about standards? Because I don't believe I've seen the outcome of one of those myself.
Yeah, so there's no single answer to that. Sometimes so we have pretty much 3 or 4 options. We can say to the services, this will have no effect, okay? And then the legal risk is on EPA. The second option is we can say it's not likely to adversely affect, and we write this biological evaluation. The services can look at the biological evaluation and conclude that it's not likely to adversely affect, in which we have a path. Or they can begin to say, you know, we think this does have will likely impact. And then we get into this negotiation. We do a biological opinion at that time. And then after the services do their biological opinion, there's some negotiation. And then they can add these, I forget the words are, something in prudent measures. Does anyone remember? Thank you. And so they'll have conditions on us. And I think the best example was the CTR, which we went through ESA. We had a list of 126 priority pollutants. Diane Fleck worked hard for that for a long year. There were some requirements put on there for us to approve certain standards within a certain time, like the methyl mercury and the selenium. Okay. As I mentioned, UCHES standards submitted to EPA do not become applicable for water quality standards purposes, for Clean Water Act purposes, until they're approved by EPA. And the approved water quality standards remain effective for Clean Water Act until EPA approves a revision or promulgates a more stringent replacement. Okay. Requirements for state adoption and EPA promulgation after disapproval. So states and tribes must adopt changes specified by EPA in the disapproval within 90 days after notification. So that's another aspect. You know, if we are disapproving, we can enter a negotiation with you to sort of make the changes. If you don't, then we have to promulgate. And then EPA has 90 days to promulgate, to finalize the promulgation. So if you add up all those things together, the 60 days, another 30 days to disapprove, that's 90. The 3-month negotiation with the state, and then another 90 days for us to promulgate if things don't work out. That adds up to that 270 days.
I'm just curious, how often does this come up in practice in your experience?
Well, the California Toxics Rule was a good example of a promulgation. We try to avoid promulgations. There was a promulgation in Florida for nutrient criteria. This is, this is hard because it requires a lot of effort on EPA headquarters to do this, so we try not to do it. So that's why the negotiation with the states early on to make sure we don't have to go this far. Yeah, go ahead, Selena.
So what if the standard adopted by the state is a revision of an existing standard? Can EPA just say, we don't want to adopt the new one, we want to keep the old one? How does that work then?
So if you adopt site-specific criteria, right, and we approve it, then that standard, the new one, is in place, and we're going to depromulgate the federal one. Was that your question?
My question is, if you don't want to adopt it?
If we don't want to adopt it,
Yeah.
well, see, that's the thing. We have two choices, right? Adopt, disapprove. In the past, we had this kind of in-between thing, which we're just not going to act. But I think those days are over. Okay, so what about gaps in existing water quality standards? I'll just read this. The EPA administrator may make a determination that new or revised standards is necessary to meet the requirements of the Act, which triggers the duties to promptly propose and promulgate such water quality standards. And that was the case in Florida. The state or authorized tribe can forestall finalization of such an EPA rule by adopting a new or revised standard that EPA deems to be in accordance with the Clean Water Act requirements before promulgations. So this is where we have to promulgate. The state says, oh my God, I don't want you to promulgate. And then you guys do it in the interim. Then we don't have to promulgate. So is all that clear? All right.
No. I love the word promulgate, and you use it really well. I just don't know what it means in this context,
okay. So
or in any other context.
Yeah. I probably should have defined what promulgate means.
Yes, and follow-up question, what does depromulgate mean?
All right. So promulgate is when EPA develops a federal criteria that applies to a state or tribe. So the CTR is a good example. They're regulations that are not in state rule, they're in federal rule that apply to California. The Florida case was another one. It's like there was petitions for EPA to promulgate in Florida because they hadn't developed nutrient criteria. And so finally EPA did promulgate, so develop standards for the state of Florida. After they did that, Florida said we want to get out from under the yoke of the federal boots, and they developed their own state nutrient standards, on which place we depromulgated the criteria.
And that's like a specific action as well,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
has like a record and.
Yeah, it's a federal action. It has a record, and it takes a long time for us to do. We go through the same type of requirements that the
But
states do.
you said that it's pretty infrequent that promulgations occur.
Yeah, we try to keep it infrequent. Is that it? That's a hand?
Yeah, that's a hand. This question goes back to public participation.
Yeah.
So specifically response to comments, are there general or specific ways the EPA goes about evaluating whether we've adequately responded to comments?
This is kind of similar to Stacy's question. We don't have any recommended ways for which you do it, but you just got to do it. And we don't have any standard threshold for they did a good job or they did a bad job. But, you know, you can tell if they did a good job or a bad job, right? And so it's just...
Yeah, let me provide a follow-up comment to that.
Yeah.
With respect to Office of Administrative Law. They are less generous than EPA in their review, and they specifically will evaluate our responses to comments, and if they deem them inadequate, they will not approve the rulemaking, because it is part and parcel, it is fundamental to the the APA and public participation pursuant to California law. And I had one situation that within the 30-day window within which they were to act, the OAL attorney followed up with me, and she identified about maybe 16 comments in the stack of voluminous comments that ostensibly were unanswered. And then that was going to hang up OAL approval. And so I quickly shored up those issues and identified where in the body of the record those specific comments were actually addressed. And so not specifically in our responses to comments, but I could basically connect the dots to meet her satisfaction. So, you know, that's just a lesson learned that I definitely want to highlight to us, because responding to comments adequately is a tough job, but indeed, rushing needlessly can create a consequence to where we don't get our rulemaking approved.
Yeah.
So.
And we do read all the comments, and that helps us inform our approval process. Like, oh, I didn't even think of that. That's that type of stuff. So it's very, very useful. Okay. Any other questions? I have time up. Sweet. All right. Thank you, guys.